Hi, welcome to Changing Suits. My name's Belle.
And my name's Taj.
On this week's episode, we have some really special guests on today. Now, as our listeners might know, we've actually started a domestic abuse service within Changing Suits because it was something that kept on coming up as we've been running the organisation. So we approached Southall Black Sisters, which I'd be surprised if there's anyone out there that doesn't know the organisation. So today we've got two very special guests from the organisation. And before I say anything else, if you could introduce yourselves and what your roles are, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm Hanana Siddiqui. I'm the Director of Policy, Campaigns and Research. I've been at Southall Black Sisters for about 40 years now. And I've done kind of everything within the organization from frontline work to policy advocacy, fundraising, management, project management, training, development, and everything. Thank you.
Perfect. And
Yeah.
Jamaria?
Hi, my name is Jaberia, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and NRPF Services at Southall Black Sisters. I've been here for 2 years now, and I manage the projects that deliver casework support to migrant women and victims of domestic violence and abuse.
Perfect. So, Hannah, you did just say, you've been with the organisation 40 years. So give us a bit of a background about Southall Black Sisters first, if you could.
Well, Southall Black Sisters is about 47 this year, and it was set up in 1979. It came out of the heat of the anti-racist movement. So you might remember that Blair Peach was killed in 1979 after there was an attempt by the National Front to demonstrate to Southall. The community came out against the National Front, and the police, we believe, killed Blair Peach, very heavy policing. Now, so Southall Black Sisters was very much involved in that kind of anti-racist work. But we also were a feminist organization, and we wanted to address the needs of women within the community because we don't think that the community leadership, including the anti-racist movement, were really addressing the needs of women. And so issues like domestic abuse, forced marriage, honor-based violence, dowry abuse were not being addressed within the community. So we set up a resource center. So we had our first center around 1982, 83. And since then, we've continued to grow in terms of providing a frontline service, but also we've maintained our campaigning edge. So we campaign at a local and a national and sometimes even international around Blacks, minoritized and migrant women and gender-based violence.
Can I ask you, when you first initially started off, how many people were there in the team?
Well, initially it was the support groups. It was, women just coming together. I wasn't there at the time, but I think it was very small. But, most of my time at Southall Black Sisters, we've only had 2 or 3 workers. People tend to think, oh, we were a huge organization, but usually it was just 2 or 3 of us really underfunded, but, with a huge amount of work to do between us. And it's only I think in the last 10 years or maybe even less than that we've grown as an organization. Now we have about 20, 22 women who are in the organization. And that's as a result of, constant fundraising, getting in donations. I mean, it's never stable. We never know how much money we're going to get every year, but we have managed to grow. We've had funding crises like every 10 years, we're kind of facing closure because there may be a loss of funding from the local authority or another funder. But most of our money, we've had to raise ourselves or through charitable trusts. It's harder to get government funding because of the work we do around Black, minoritized and migrant women.
Can I ask, Javeria, you've come into the organisation quite new. What have you found with the people that you are in contact? I mean, there's been a lot of change with how much the South Asian community talks about domestic abuse. That's the first thing. But there is still a massive stigma around the topic. So when you joined the organisation, you said that you really appreciate being in the organisation. What is it that drew you to Southall Black Sisters?
I think talking about the stigma and how within communities they still talk about violence and abuse, you would be amazed to see that even though we have come so far, the stigmatization and talking about abuse in the same way still exists. And people, women especially, face the same level of distrust and isolation within their communities because the systems are still the same. There is support available for them, but how do we make sure that women are aware of the support that is available to them? That is still the same. And it's a matter of reaching out to those communities. It's a matter of informing them that there is support available. It's a matter of making sure that the other professionals that are working with those women in other areas, they are aware of what the indicators are, what might look like as a violence and abusive behavior, and how to pick it up rather than putting it on, or it's a cultural thing and that is going to happen in those communities. That's really important, but also familiarizing them with what kind of support and how to offer them that support. And going towards the second part of your question, I have been in the sector for 10 years now. And I guess I have to give credit to my previous manager who introduced me with the amazing work of Southall Black Sisters and how their focus was on migrant women, and especially women who had no access to public funds, because that's where we really lack support in the national, local, and the wider context. There is no support available for women who are victims of violence and abuse, who want to leave those relationships or want to get out of those situations, but there is no support available for them. And then I came across the work that SBS is doing, especially for women who have no access to public fund, and that's what made me, I guess, a lifelong fan of SBS.
What do you mean a lack of support? That would be interesting to know.
So when women who are here on any kind of immigration stay, and I would say, Hanana, please pitch in where you feel that I'm missing something. There is not enough support available for them. For example, when they want to access a safe refuge, if they have no access to public funds, a refuge won't accept them. And so that means that there is nowhere for them to go. So if they have no family, or there is family, but they don't want to go to a family because families put pressure on them, there is no independent safe accommodation for them because they have access to public funds. And so that is one of the biggest barrier why women would not reach out for support or reach out to professionals, because they understand that we don't have access to public funds. We are not going to get the same level of support that anybody else who has entitlement to public funds would get.
No recourse to public funds means that you don't have access to most social security benefits or housing benefit or housing from the local authority. And this is a condition often imposed on anyone who has a temporary visa in this country. The problem is that if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you cannot leave that relationship, an abusive relationship, because you're frightened of being destitute. And also, if you have insecure status, you can also be subject to deportation. And so there's like a double bind, a stark choice that women have to make between staying in an abusive relationship or leaving it and facing both deportation in many cases and destitution in many cases that we deal with. And the problem is with getting access to a refuge, which is safe accommodation, is that women cannot pay their rent. If you can't get housing benefit, you can't pay your rent. So a lot of refugees will turn women away because they cannot pay their rent. We have set up temporary schemes. One scheme is called the Support for Migrant Victims Scheme, which is funded by the Home Office. But it's temporary at the moment. And also, it doesn't give us enough money to support women. So you can get into a refuge through that scheme, but only for about 6 weeks. And it's not going to be enough in terms of your income support. You need your living costs either. And those with children can go to social services. But the problem is a lot of the time social services says, well, we have a duty under the Children's Act towards the children, but not the mother. So they may threaten to, take the child into care or place that child with an abusive father. Whereas actually they should be putting the mother and the child together. It actually is cheaper on the state to do that. But a lot of women are deterred from seeking help from social services because they don't want to lose their children. So the situation, it's not it's dire out there really for migrant women. Not only do they have no recourse to public funds, but some of them also cannot get indefinite leave to remain in this country. Those who are victims of domestic violence who are here on a spousal visa can stay as victims of domestic abuse if they can show that they're a victim. And that's a reform that we managed to campaign for and successfully win in over a period of about 30 years. But that doesn't protect women with other visas who are on non-spousal visas. They're still subject to deportation. So one of our current campaigns at the moment is to extend the concessions that are available for those who are on spousal visas. The concession is that they can get access to benefits for about 3 months whilst they apply to stay here indefinitely. And we want to extend that to women on other visas because their experience of abuse is no different. And in fact, they're far more vulnerable because they have fewer rights in this country and they may have problems around documentation because their husbands or abusers have taken away their documents. They maybe have no support at all from the community because they're accused of having brought dishonor onto the community and onto the families, or they may not have family in this country.
Jawari, did you want to come in on a point that
Yes, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that the temporary accommodation that we provide, the funding that we have set up, it provides accommodation for between 12 to 16 weeks, but it depends on the amount about the immigration status and the outcomes of those immigration status. But I have to say that the response from Home Office doesn't mean that their immigration status is going to get resolved in those weeks. Like Hanana said, the women who are here on spouse visa, they have a pretty straightforward route, and usually it gets resolved within 6 weeks of time, and they then have access to public funds. But women who are here on other types of visa, that is something that doesn't get resolved more than often. And so we look at alternative avenues for those women after the funding is over. And just so that you can understand the context of funding and how difficult it is to offer this support, we have two projects that offer accommodation and subsistence to women who are victims of domestic violence and who have no access to public funds. One is a national project where we deliver this service in partnership with other charities who are our partners, and one is a Pan London project. And with the Pan London project, we can only support up to 20 to 30 women by Southall Black Sisters in a year. And so you can imagine that as compared to the need, the response is not enough.
and this was a question that I had earlier actually. What are we thinking in regards? We know that most people from the South Asian community do not report domestic abuse, whatever the reason is, whatever the barriers are. What numbers are reported, firstly? And I might be throwing you in there, but the reason I ask is how many people are you having come to your service? And then where you've just said, Javaria, only 22 people can be supported, it just gives us a bit of a sort of statistical way of looking at how small that number actually is.
Deal with about 5,000 cases and inquiries per year. I mean, obviously that doesn't reflect the true need out there. So I think what we would like to see is obviously the government to changing the law so that women, regardless of their immigration status, are able to access public funds and get indefinite leave to remain.
And this bit's going to be a bit controversial, with the political landscape as it is, and it is getting more and more uncertain. That is the way society is going, unfortunately. What kind of response do you get from the government and the community as a whole from the work that you're doing?
I mean, the government previously, under the conservative governments, they weren't, sympathetic in terms of migrant women, although they did introduce some concessions for those on spousal visas. Under the new government, we were hoping to expand that to all women, regardless of their immigration status. Unfortunately, so far, we have not been successful. And we have been continuing to lobby with the For example, we introduced an amendment to the and policing bill so that all women are able to get access to public funds. And so far, we haven't had an effective response from the government. And the other thing that we have been campaigning on that you talked about earlier about women reporting abuse, in most cases, women do not report abuse to the police, particularly if you have insecure immigration status. It's because they are frightened that their details will then be shared with the Home Office, immigration enforcement in particular, and they are worried that they will be removed from the country, even if they just go to the police seeking protection and reporting an abusive incident. So we would say that a lot of women, particularly migrant women, do not report. And one of the things that we are campaigning for with other organizations, such as the Latin American Women's Rights Service, is to introduce what we call a firewall, which creates a barrier between women reporting to the police or other statutory agencies and data being shared with the Home Office Immigration Enforcement Service. The idea is that there isn't that data sharing. So by not having that data sharing, women will feel freer to be able to come forward. They'll have increased confidence in the system. They're more likely to hold perpetrators accountable. They're more likely to get protection. And at the moment, I think in cases of migrant women, perpetrators have got immunity because women are too frightened to go to the police, for example, to report abuse and to hold them accountable.
Generally, how have the police been in supporting your organisation? Do you think there needs to be more work done, or is there a good relationship with the police and Southall Black Sisters?
I think it's a mixed picture. I think on the ground, and this is really important, individual officers are really important. If they're sympathetic and supportive, if they can understand the issues and effectively intervene, then that is, a very good relationship. But I don't think that relationship is consistent, that the response of the police to domestic abuse, particularly within Black, minoritized, and migrant community, is not consistent. It could be racist. It could be an approach which doesn't want to seem to be interfering in minority cultures because they want to respect minority cultures, which sort of kind of exist under multicultural thinking. And the idea is that they're trying to be culturally sensitive, but actually it means that they don't really protect women in those communities against domestic abuse. On a more national level, in terms of the policies of the state, I think that the the police itself has some very good policies which we have influenced, and we've been in their working groups, we've been going to their conferences and meetings and trying to influence that. And yes, and there's some very good guidance out there and policies that are still developing in the police force, but they're not necessarily being implemented on the ground in any very consistent way. There are pockets of good practice, but there isn't enough in terms of the full scale implementation that we need. And to give you an example, I mean, this is a more extreme example where a woman has committed suicide, and we deal with homicide, suicide, and honor killings, which we think that, Black and minoritized women are overrepresented in. And when the police, say they're going to investigate a suicide, they don't really investigate it as a crime. They just see it as someone, well, inflicting harm upon themselves, and they don't take it seriously in terms of the involvement of a third party, even if that third party, was abusive towards them. And although the police are beginning to change that and have done some research to look at abuse related suicide and have introduced policies to investigate it further, it's really a new policy. And a lot of cases that we would argue of suicide should be prosecuted as homicide, as murder. And there should be, more prosecutions around this. There's only been one successful conviction for manslaughter, which was abuse-related suicide. And so one of our campaigns is for abuse-related suicides to be recognised as homicide.
I was going to say, Hanana, this actually came up in the news not too long ago, didn't it? I don't know when that case that you're referring to, where it was where the law had changed for that case, but this isn't an issue just for the South Asian or the ethnic diverse communities. It's actually for white communities as well. And that
Yeah.
case that was successful was a lady that was from the white community, if I'm
Yes,
not mistaken.
she was. And the thing is that the research by the police has shown that suicide, abuse-related suicide, is now overtaken homicide. So women are more likely to kill themselves than be killed as a result of domestic abuse. So it does exist in all communities. But what we're arguing is that in Black, minoritized, and migrant communities, it may well be overrepresented. Some of the research we've done in the past ourselves as an organization, and some of the academic research, for example, has shown in the past that Asian women are 3 times more likely to kill themselves as a result of abuse. Now, this is old research and that needs to be updated. But the work that we've done with women shows there's a high rate of self harm, suicide ideation, attempted suicide, and suicide itself, I would argue, as a result of things like domestic abuse, sexual violence, forced marriage, honor based abuse, dowry related abuse. And I think that research needs to be done, but I think there could be improvements in terms of the investigation of suicide and self harm, but also the national suicide strategy and the health services could also be responding better in preventing suicides. The national suicide strategy sees domestic abuse as a risk factor, but they don't actually see them, victims, victim survivors of domestic abuse as a priority group that requires their intervention. And really, they should be seen as a priority group. Now, we did a recent case, the case of Michelle Sparman, which is a British Caribbean woman who committed suicide after being harassed by her former partner over a period of time. He bombarded her with emails and messages and calls and so forth. The coroner found that Michelle had a justified feeling of being abused. So basically, the coroner recognized the link between the suicide and the abuse. And I think coroner's courts are getting better at those kind of findings, but they also got a long way to go in recognizing and making that link and making findings on unlawful killings. In that case, we're calling for the police to reopen the case because we feel that they should have been prosecuted. The perpetrator should have been prosecuted for this. So I think that, for Asian women or women from sort of Middle Eastern backgrounds or from minority groups, we've found that notions of honor-based violence, for example, very strong notions of honor and shame, are kind of also driving women to self-harm and to commit suicide. And we do think that
Can I come in here in regards to honor-based killing? Well, even the forced marriage, and something you said earlier, where you said that the police sometimes aren't responsive because they're trying to be culturally sensitive.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting point, only because of the work that we do. We sort of say, well, actually, you do need to be more sensitive. But actually, now what you've said is on the negative, that they might be oversensitizing it, in which case the actual issue isn't being dealt with. Jawari, I just want you to come in here. So on the honor-based killing aspect, as soon as you talk to someone in the police, the experience that we've had when we're talking to someone, honor-based killing definitely comes up. Forced marriages always comes up. And it's a really hard maneuver when we're having that conversation to say, well, actually, as soon as you hear honor, they're already putting honor-based killing. Whereas actually honor is quite a positive language. We've sort of put a negative on there. So where is the cultural sensitivity going, overstepping the mark, in which case it's becoming a negative thing? Because as soon as we hear these words, we feel like they're not being culturally sensitive. I don't know if that's a question that even makes sense.
It does, and I'm gonna try. What happens is, it's about the fact that having an in-depth understanding of what actually the harmful practice is that they are challenging, or what the indicators are that they're picking up. So, for example, one of the issues that we face constantly in the casework is that when we, for example, receive referrals for where professionals are asking for support, they do not understand and they do not ask the relevant questions. And so we as an organization have a practice where we have developed tools that we give to our caseworkers to ask those important questions so that we get a proper understanding of what is it that they're dealing with, what is the kind of abuse, what is the kind of violence that they're finding themselves in, and then how do we provide support for that, and how do we then train the organizations, train the professionals to then deal with those issues. Because it would be, sometimes we come across individuals, professionals, who do not understand what is the arranged marriage. What does it mean to be married?
And what does it mean? Just so our listeners know, what does arranged marriage mean?
I think the arranged marriage is, where family may get involved in matchmaking, arranging the marriage for you rather than you choosing for yourself. Now, that's been a traditional practice in many South Asian communities, as you probably know. But I think what we got to obviously recognize is where an arranged marriage becomes a forced marriage.
Forced, 100%, yeah.
A forced marriage is there could be very, very subtle pressures. It doesn't have to be over dramatic things like, you've been abducted, taken abroad, and, forced into a marriage physically, forced to marry someone. But it can be like the emotional pressures, the emotional blackmails that you may experience. Like your parents might say, well, this is our honor that you get married, and we promised that you would marry your cousin, for example. So you were betrothed at birth in many cases, or at least that, that there is a desire in many families to marry a cousin so that, wealth, for example, stays within the family, or that, there may be suspicions about marrying outside of the family. And the problem is that, if a lot of young women or girls and some boys and men feel the pressure to actually go and have marriage in order to, out of respect for their parents, out of a sense of duty to their parents or their elders, and really but they're still unhappy about the marriage. And I think when you are unhappy about the marriage, then it becomes a forced marriage. You might still be saying, I'm doing it because I love my parents, but actually you're not happy about it. So if either party are unhappy, then it becomes a forced marriage.
I was going to say, now we're doing explanations. What does honor-based abuse mean as well?
Well, honor-based abuse is about the motivation for violence against women and girls. So it could be domestic abuse, it could be a forced marriage, but it's usually the perpetrator's perspective, which is that we want to maintain the honor of our family and our community. And often family honor rests on the behavior of women. So particularly their sexual behavior, which means that women are severely controlled around their sexual conduct, but also around their autonomy. And if they seem to have transgressed any of those expectations on them, which are usually very traditional gender roles, then they're accused of bringing shame and dishonor to the family. And the honor-based abuse can result if there is a need, or the family feels that they need to maintain or restore or protect the honor of their family and their community. And that could be anything from controlling women, preventing them from going out, preventing them from wearing Western clothes, for example, to physical violence, to a forced marriage, to abduction and taking them abroad and forcing them into marriage there. Or at the more extreme end, women are either driven to kill themselves in what we call honor killing, also honor suicide, but also you have honor killings. And so we've done many cases of honor killings, and one of the more prominent ones was that of Banaz Mahmood, who was killed by her father and uncle and 5 male cousins in 2006. And we helped her sister, Bakal Mahmood, and she was the only one in the family who gave evidence for the prosecution, and which did lead to the conviction of all the killers. But she's now on a witness protection scheme because she's not, not safe for life really from her family or her community. So one of the campaigns we're doing with Bakal, so I've worked with her for 20 years, and we've sort of been working with her right from the very beginning in supporting her with the prosecution. But now she's campaigning on what we call Benazir's Law. Benazir's Law is basically trying to get honor recognized as an aggravating factor in sentencing, for criminal sentencing. So for Bakal, even though her father and her uncles and cousins were convicted of murder, she didn't feel that they got long enough sentences. And so this is a common feeling amongst bereaved families, that they feel that they must, fight for not only justice, but when they do get justice, or when they do get a conviction, the sentences are not long enough. They doesn't reflect the crime. And what we're saying, that if something is motivated by, this false justification that this was done in the name of honor, like you said, honor can be a good thing if it's about respect and integrity, but this is not about respect and integrity. It's about controlling women, and it's been used to control women and used justified culturally to do so. So what we're arguing for is that these justifications are not acceptable by the state. And by introducing that change, the government can help to create change within communities, change attitudes, change values, cultural and religious value systems, but also in getting agencies to respond more effectively to honor-based abuse. It's true what Javeria said earlier, that they don't actually understand what honor-based abuse is, so there needs to be more awareness and more effective interventions by agencies to prevent honor-based abuse and to handle it when it does occur.
In regards to everything we've already spoken about, you can see how complex the whole thing is for a woman that is going through domestic abuse. Not only are you being impacted physically, perhaps mentally, maybe financially, but you're up against a system that is so hard to get through.
Yeah.
So let's flip it on the other side. So the perpetrator and the culture that we're all in, is there any work being done at the moment to sort of change that sort of cultural sort of aspect of the gender inequalities, I'd say, but any work to do with the perpetrator? Because if we change the way a community thinks, surely this could be a lot more easier for people that are going victims of domestic abuse.
I think there isn't a lot of work being done around perpetrators in Black, minoritized, and migrant communities. There are perpetrator programs, but they're not necessarily geared to perpetrators from those minority communities, because they're not really addressing things like honor and shame, and honor-based abuse and gender inequality within those communities. The government is looking at ways of increasing perpetrator programs around honor-based abuse. But remember, they're also quite complex, because honor-based abuse can often involve multiple perpetrators, because it's about family honor and community honor. So in Benazir's case, it was about 50 men, according to the police, who were involved in some kind of conspiracy or the cover-up of Benazir's killing. So, and it includes women as well, because women may condone it or get involved in that conspiracy. And usually it's often because they lack power within the family, and they are expected to take forward the notions, or the more conservative notions of honor, because we're actually talking about patriarchal systems. So women may be caught up in that because they're expected to, perpetuate the same systems and lack the power to be able to change them effectively. But it does mean that women may be involved in honor-based abuse as well. So, a perpetrator program has to deal with the whole family or the whole community. Like domestic abuse cases where there may just be one perpetrator. So, so I think that there needs to be a lot more work in the community as well, not just perpetrator programs. You need to sort of address this at, in many levels. So one is obviously perpetrator interventions which need a lot of development, but also you need education in the community, work in schools and colleges with young people, addressing the power of the community and religious leaders who tend to be male, very conservative, and you want them to either condemn violence against women in those communities or to make sure they support the organizations who are trying to address these problems, like Southall Black Sisters. But normally they don't support us. They don't, they don't condemn violence against women and girls, usually for cultural and religious reasons. That's their argument. Then there's also the need to work with families within communities as well, and agencies as well, in order to address the problem more widely. So I think that prevention work is important, but also services are important. Organizations like Southall Black Sisters exist within the community. We provide alternatives to women and girls because those alternatives are usually not provided by the community leadership, which tend to be quite conservative, or other groups within the community. So secular feminist, anti-racist organizations like Southall Black Sisters is the one that provides the alternatives. But then they are often underfunded. And so, there needs to be far more state support for those organizations to address those needs, but also more support within the community from the community leadership. They should be providing, making sure that we're properly funded. They should be making sure that women are referred to our services. But we don't get the support. We're often being attacked by the community leadership. We're often accused of being home wreckers or being, anti-Asian or against the Asian culture. So I think that there needs to be a lot of work that needs to change within the community in order to address these problems.
So places of worship, I just wanted to touch on that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because within Swindon we've been quite lucky where we've been able to go into places of worship and we're getting support from committees? Do you think it's the older generation that are stopping organisations like Southall Black Sisters to come in and basically support women? Or do you think it's just like a thing where they're like, we don't want women to have any sort of control? What is the barrier
I
for?
think it's a mixed picture. I think that the rise of religious fundamentalism is has risen not just necessarily in the older generations, but in the younger generations, particularly amongst young men who are also can be quite conservative around women's rights. And so I think that it's not just about the elders and the older generation. Some of them actually in Southall can be quite, certainly the older generation can be secular and quite progressive and anti-racist and can be supportive at times, but the conservative elements, of course, are not. But we've seen the growth of religious fundamentalism has had an impact on women's rights within our own communities. There's a pressure on women to conform to more traditional gender roles. And I think that we've still got some way to go. So it's not a generational thing. I think you need to empower women by providing them with support, with services and organizations like Southall Black Sisters. But also you need to address things like the rise of religious fundamentalism, work with boys and young men in schools and colleges. So and look at what men are thinking and how they're developing masculinity, ideas around masculinity, but also around cultural expectations that men have on them, but also their expectation of women, which tend to be quite traditional. And religious fundamentalism itself has to be tackled so that you get more progressive interpretations of religion, which would respect women's rights and empower women.
Jawari, if we talk about if an individual is going through domestic abuse, she's got all of these barriers that we've already spoken about. What is her best course of action from now?
I think the first step is to reach out for support. And we offer, if I'm going to talk about our organization, we offer that in a variety of like ways. And one of the easiest ways is to get in touch through our helpline, because our helpline has a national reach and international reach as well in some of the cases. And so it is crucial step to just get information about what are my options, what are the rights that I am entitled to, and what can I do in this situation. Just getting an independent advice from somebody who's aware of the abuse and the trauma and the legal options and other options that are available. I know it sounds like, okay, there might be some options, and there are going to be complex cases when there are very, very few options. Still, it makes such a big difference to reach out for support and to speak
That
to
knowledge.
somebody exactly who is
Yeah.
aware of your situation, who can offer you support, emotional support, practical support, who can just offer you some avenues to just have that respite. And going back to the service that we were talking about, the idea of dealing with all of this when you have no support available makes it so difficult. But when you know that, okay, I can have access to this support from the organizations, and I can just have that space to just distance myself from the ongoing trauma, the abuse, the violence that I am suffering, and just think about, okay, what are my options? What am I entitled to legally? What are my rights? And what can I do? That is such a crucial step that is missing, because women are rushed from one service to another, from one support to another, because the whole picture is so fragmented that nobody is thinking that they need a second to breathe. They need a second to just like actually think about what is it that they want. It's not about, okay, you're going through this is what you're entitled to, this is what you're going to get, and just rush from point A to point B. It's about giving them their options and just empowering them enough so that they can make a decision for themselves. And that is the big difference that we want to see.
And that's it. It is their decision at the end of the day. It's that
Exactly.
support that is being offered. There's no force there. It is your option.
Yep.
It's amazing.
So, okay, earlier I talked about no recourse to public funds. We still want the change in the law, but also I want to say that the government has said that they're going to introduce a firewall to aid reporting migrant women to report domestic abuse to the police and other services. But this is quite an early stage. We're still trying to work out the details of that. We would want a full firewall so that there is no data sharing between the police and immigration enforcement. And the other thing is that we are campaigning and have introduced amendments to the Crime and Policing Bill on abuse-related suicide and on Benazir's law. And over 50 MPs have supported both of these amendments. So there's a lot of support for these changes.
Perfect. Thank you for all of the information that you've given us today and the amazing work that you do. And I am going to say I'm kind of fangirling you as well, Hanana. I think just the knowledge you've got is absolutely amazing. But thank you for coming on today. That's goodbye
Thank
from
you.
me.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.